So we're just recording the meeting and transcribing as well for kind of note-taking purposes later on. So just to introduce everybody to the meeting, this is a working group within ISCET, and this is our second working group meeting. And the idea of the working group is to put together a survey from which we aim to characterise eye tracker use, and that's kind of clinical eye tracking use. So the small working group is kind of putting together the survey, hopefully approving questions and structure within the survey. And then the idea at the moment is for it to be hosted on Qualtrics, and we will gain ethical approval for this via the University of Sheffield, because some preliminary inquiries about that suggest that that's all okay. There are a couple of things that we've kind of got specifically to ask at this stage, and what that might make me do is, as the person hopefully gaining ethical approval for this via the University of Sheffield, I think once we've ironed out how we want this to work, I think I'm going to go back and just double check that this is still okay before we spend an awful lot more time on all the ethical approval side of it. So there's a couple of questions for the group, but I think it will be worth us double checking at this early stage whether the University of Sheffield are still happy for me to do that, because I think if the answer is no, either we need some discussion about how the survey is going to work, or we need an alternative person to kind of seek approval. Is that okay with everybody? Anybody kind of got any questions at this stage before we start, or is everybody happy and understands where we're up to and just happy to dive in? I know that a few people on the call were in the last working group meeting, but anybody in the working group is very welcome to contribute in any way. We do appreciate that not everybody will be able to make every meeting, so we tried to get to a certain stage where certain people were kind of taking the role on kind of jobs and kind of actions to try and suggest wording of questions and how things might be structured. And there are a few things that have come up as a result of that. One was a question from Siwan Chen, which was, should we have a hypothesis prior to data collection, considering that one of our aims is to publish this in a scientific journal? Do we want to use the results to kind of test the hypothesis? So this wasn't something I'd immediately thought that we would do, but I think it's probably worth some discussion now, because it probably changes it in my mind from a kind of survey kind of characterizing clinical eye tracker use to being more of a research study with a hypothesis that we would then test with results. So I just wondered what people thought on that.
So my immediate thought is, I don't think necessarily that given the aim of this is about prioritising what ISCET's going to work on first, I don't see that it necessarily requires a hypothesis to be valid in what it is. Yes, it doesn't fit the traditional model of a scientific study, but I think that doesn't mean it's outside the remit of journals to publish it. So my view is that without a particular reason other than potentially would that help to publish it, I don't think it's necessary.
Rasha, do you want to come in on that point?
I'm still thinking, actually, but I think Matt's mic is a little bit like I could not hear every word. Could you do something? I was, because I didn't actually listen to. I didn't understand what you said.
I'll summarise, hopefully I won't say that louder. My view is that I don't think it's necessary for us to have a scientific hypothesis in order to be valid for publication. It's not a traditional scientific study, it's a survey for the purposes of setting priorities for what needs standardisation.
I agree.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just as a, I think that like as a survey, it totally makes sense. This said, I think that it would be a great opportunity for us to just ask a simple question. Do you think that that there are sufficient standards for the use of eye tracking in clinical research right now? Just that single one question, we could ask that, and like almost certainly like 0 out of 100%. And the chi-square for that is like undefined, right? It's infinite. And so I think that it would be a great opportunity for us to do that, or we could ask it as a Likert, and that way actually have like reasonable statistics on it. And as far as hypothesis, this is a straw man, but I think it makes a great point for the need for ISCET. And can I just ask, like, how are we pronouncing this group's name? Is it ISCET, like a biscuit, or is it like ISCET?
So it did include on ISEV, which is International Society for Clinical Electrophysiology of Vision. That's typically, I think, people are pronouncing it as ISET.
ISET. Oh, nice. Okay. I just got to say, your microphone is really bad.
Okay. Is it video?
It's very, very distorted.
Okay.
It's not a reflection on you as a person. I just want to also clarify.
Well, maybe just let Matt put himself on mute and see if he can do anything with the audio at all. I know my laptop's awful, just like running off the regular mic, hence the reason I tend to like wire in these days. But sometimes it's not so easy to change it. Okay. So, Fred, I've just noted down your kind of question. As part of our discussions about the structure of the survey, we were talking about some kind of questions that we could ask people more generally before they had specific questions that were relevant to them. So do you, and there was some discussion about, do you have or do you use got any guidelines at present for clinical eye tracking? But I think what would naturally follow on is, do you think there are sufficient guidelines that exist already? Because it may well be that we're just not aware of them and other people have got some that are perfectly adequate for their purposes. And there seems no need to kind of or start working on things that already exist. So I've just made a note of that. So it's sounding like Matt's not in favour of there being a hypothesis, potentially. I mean, that doesn't mean that we can't have Likert scales and analyse things and, statistically describe the results or analyse the results if there is no hypothesis. Does anybody feel we should have a hypothesis?
Well, only in that loose sense of like, Likert scale of what's the sufficiency of eye tracking in the field. I think it's just, like I said, it's a straw man. No one will believe it's a true scientific, inquiry. But I think that also kind of acknowledges, I forget who made the recommendation. So it is kind of a hypothesis. So, it's just, we're agreeable, very agreeable people.
Fiona.
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't at the last meeting, so it's the first time, I know Fred and Matt a little, but it's the first time kind of getting into what the goal is here. And I think whether or not you have hypotheses is really dependent on what is the goal of the overall work. And I apologize if this is already very clear to everyone, but if there was a way to just briefly summarize for my sake.
Absolutely, no problem at all. So we have currently stated that the aim of, let me flip back to here. So the aims of this working group is to characterise current international clinical use of eye trackers with an overarching aim of allowing ISCET to prioritise clinical conditions for guideline development. So that's kind of us as a group. And then what's drafted at the moment is the purpose of the survey is to characterise current clinical use of eye trackers globally and to explore whether there is a need or a desire for guidelines to be developed to support good practice for clinical eye tracking. And that's just all being in draft form at the moment. So
okay. Yeah, I think I contributed to some of those docs, just adding some more eye trackers and so on. So is the goal then to try and standardize eye data quality in some way for clinical measures, or?
The overarching goal here is, sorry, tell me if you can't hear me at all. The overarching goal is to produce standard protocols for clinical procedures involving eye tracking. So that's both the testing and the analysis side of things. Obviously, data quality is an important part of that, because without good data quality, then we don't know what we're talking about clinically. But primarily, it's about having agreement on how you actually how you undertake the tests, what's necessary, what's required, both in terms of hardware and in terms of the actual protocols themselves. Yeah.
Okay, I caught some of that. Okay, yeah. So you're looking at things like VHIT and various measures used for clinical diagnosis, and to try and standardize what the requirements of hardware and data quality should be for those measures to be reliable enough for diagnosis. Is that about right? Okay. So it may be useful, like 10 years ago, we had an eye data quality committee. We worked with 15 experts around the world on it for many years. It never completed, but that work is extant, and we had quite a few publications out of it, but we haven't published the overall results yet, because we recorded 200 people on 17 eye trackers, and it's a lot of data. But we do eventually hope to get it out now, and I think that we could probably make that available if it's useful for this effort too. It wasn't specifically looking at clinical measures, because it was coming from a broader perspective of just also cognitive measures, and many other measures require high data quality, and there's not a lot out there to say how we should assess them. But within that group, we did come up with agreed measures, also with the major manufacturers of eye trackers. In terms of clinical eye tracking, that manufacturer list at the time did not include big players like ISCET now, who are, they make the intraocustics system that's often used in hospitals for diagnosis of balance disorders and so on. That wasn't one of the systems we tested, and some systems have disappeared and new ones appeared also in the intervening years. But the methods of measuring the data quality, and quite some work towards defining which data quality is needed for which kinds of measures. Like, for example, looking at main sequence for neurological diagnosis, you need to have either a certain sample rate to correctly extract peak velocity of saccade, but there are other potential methods that are not so sample rate dependent and so on. So just to say that there is a lot of work already done, and the goal of that was an international standard. We looked into doing that with the ISO. And I have a different standard on eye tracking that I led, which is actually a standard now, but that's about infrared light exposure. And it's just kind of useful in terms of the CIE and ISO criteria for developing a standard are pretty much the same, because the ISO automatically takes over CIE standards. So in terms of the sort of lighting the pathway towards an established standard, that some of that info and work that we did could also be potentially useful. So just to say, yeah. And we also did a survey of what standards exist and whether they could be applied. And the answer is, we need a standard. Yeah.
Perfect. I think we will need to reference a lot of this work. And if you could share at least the published part of it, I think that'll be.
Yeah, what we published was mostly some of, testing, and they were, experiments, and, they were studies in the more traditional sense than a survey, because we have this massive data set, and we used that, which included a DPI eye tracker, which is the, you know, as kind of gold standard was the thought, because this old analog eye tracker is what a lot of the, not officially standardized, but a lot of what the seminal work on eye tracking and defining things like, you know, the main sequence came from this old DPI tracker, which nobody uses anymore, or very few. So we recorded those 200 people on that eye tracker plus all the video based and head mounted ones in order to test whether standard measures of data quality would be fair to all different kinds of systems, and in order to, you know, look at different ways of selecting samples that you include in the calculation of things like temporal and spatial precision and accuracy and so on. Because we did a survey of all the different manufacturer spec sheets, and what you find is everyone says they're accurate to within half a degree, you know, even though that's almost never the case. It can be better or worse, but it's just a number that appeared and nobody quite knows where it came from, this half a degree that's ubiquitous. Probably originally from the DPI, but you know, all of the manufacturers also had completely different ways of selecting the samples they were going to include. And some of them quite openly stated, we remove outlier samples and then calculate the root mean square or standard deviation, which of course, that doesn't really make sense because you've removed all the variance before you take the measure of variance, you know. So we did agree together with SO Research, Toby, SMI, who are now Apple, iTribe, who are now, you know, Meta, and ASL trackers, a huge number of the manufacturers agreed on the methods of measuring. And that was not easy. That took 3 years. What we found, like little things, like we tested to see, well, sample to sample RMS is biased towards higher sample rates mathematically. So maybe standard deviation or the bivariate contra ellipse area might be a more equitable measure, you know, when, you know, that isn't sample rate biased, little things like that. We did a lot of work to get to consensus across those kind of things. So that's just to give an idea, and maybe we can, if it's of interest to this group or useful to this group, you know, just to give a sort of general overview of what we have, and I'd be happy to collaborate towards getting that out there too.
So before I hand over to Fred, because he's got his hand up, I think Matt's made a point that actually it's probably very valuable to take it to the main ISCET meeting, this kind of little working groups just about the survey development really, but it sounds like your previous work's got much broader reach and much broader relevance. Could I just double check what clinical area that was related to, Fiona?
It wasn't specific to any particular area of use of eye trackers. It took a very broad view. And so it would have included clinical work, fundamental research, you know, gaze control. You know, the demands of data quality are different, but that doesn't mean that the measures of data quality should be, was the idea. And of course, many systems are used across different domains. It's not like people are manufacturing systems for clinical or research or whatever else. The iLink is used in all, for example. But at the moment, I'm working in the hospital as well as at DTU, trying to come up with methods of improving measures like VHIT and gain in smooth pursuit that are used to diagnose balance disorders. So from that point of view, I'm more interested in clinical measures that are used in the hospital under time pressure and sometimes in emergency rooms where you need reliable results quickly. And I'm probably more interested in that now than I was when I did that standardization work, actually, because at that time it was mostly fundamental research I was doing.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Fred, who's got his hand up. Thanks. You're just on mute, Fred.
Yeah, I think it's obviously of high interest, and it's good to actually see you on a meeting. Um, uh, I think that Matt is right, that this is kind of like something that's kind of sits on the side of what we're kind of focusing on now, like these specific type of data quality results. And I think that should be a main meeting discussion. In terms of the needs of the clinical work, I think Fiona said it really well, which is like all of the applications are different and like the needs are different. There's probably a core of eye tracking quality measures that we probably want to acknowledge. And I think that it's possibly also something that we don't necessarily want to focus on specifically. I think that the like, and this is just me, kind of my perspective, is that this group exists in a unique space to kind of create the template of the template that is used to evaluate clinical eye tracking applications, because something like that doesn't exist. And the specific implementation of each of those clinical applications is going to depend on a set of very clearly defined outcome variables that are going to kind of exist outside of necessarily, like we all think that, a 0.5 degree accuracy is really good. They're all lying, of course, right? Like all the eye tracking systems are when they reported, it's actually not true. But the, that actually isn't the case. Like you do web-based eye tracking and like the all bets are off, right? You're not going to get 0.5 degrees. And so it's kind of some type of tension between the application and the technologies that we have available. And I think that perhaps like when we design the survey, we should design it in consideration of getting as much information about both specific needs and the things that kind of set apart this from a general survey of eye tracking data quality, which I think is not the purpose, though. I'm happy to defer to anyone.
So I guess with that in mind, Fiona, you mentioned that you'd previously kind of surveyed kind of eye tracker use. Do you feel that what you've already done with your group is being duplicated here, or do you feel like
No.
we're doing something different? Because I think if something exists that could give us the information we're looking for, it doesn't seem useful to duplicate it.
I definitely don't think you're duplicating, and I definitely think this is worthwhile and valid work, and that's why I'm here. But so what we had done was look more for what are equitable ways to compare systems data quality and to what are the minimum guidelines that should be used in order to report data quality in papers. So it was in recognition of the fact that all work with eye trackers is currently suffering from a validity question, especially as more and more new eye trackers come out and the data quality can be so variant, and it's being used also in less controlled environments, which also have an effect. So we just took that broader perspective, but of course, there are areas where the data quality demands are much, much higher. And some of the measures that are used in fundamental research fall into that category. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of the clinical measures, which tend to be more interested in eye dynamics than things like gaze location that might be part of a lot of research. Once you're talking about eye dynamics and the eye in motion, then the data quality constraints are different. And they're not only spatial data quality that's important, but then equally temporal, because either will equally mess up the dynamics trace. So I think that it does make sense to look specifically at clinical measures, because they do, most of the neurologically relevant measures do involve eye dynamics rather than gaze location in the world. So I think it's worth, and also because the repercussions of poor clinical diagnosis are also different to a paper that maybe is not, as reliable as it might like to be, especially in the ER or something, when there's a lot of evidence that eye tracking might have diagnostic power for conditions where, because the eye data quality maybe hasn't been standardized and controlled enough, it's just very difficult to see your way through mixed results with those measures. But if there was a standard requirement of data quality, then I think we would start to have much more rapid development that would see what eye tracking can actually diagnose. So the classic example of what I'm talking about maybe would be a lot of research suggesting that even Alzheimer's can be detected with eye tracking before any other symptoms emerge. And there's mixed results on that. And it's not the only one I could list. There's, you know yourselves, there's a lot of cases where there's evidence that eye tracking can be diagnostic, but it's not, because there's just been such variance in the eye data quality of the trackers used in the space. So if that answers.
Yeah, it does. And I think that probably kind of nicely summarizes the problem. And one, I guess, as a group, ISCET are trying to approach this from numerous different directions. And the direction of this working group was to say, okay, before we even start imposing or coming up with kind of guidelines for how things should be measured, who out there should we even be speaking to? Because I'm aware that in the UK, I have a very UK-centric view on what's being done. So the purpose of this survey was to try and gather information about who is out there internationally doing eye tracking clinically. And what we've tried to do is try to define what we mean by that, so that we can get more of a picture of who is doing this, and then ask them, what are you doing? How are you doing it? What kit are you using? And do you have existing guidelines? Do you think guidelines would be helpful? And where do you think we should start?
Sorry, as just a practical recommendation, and I'm sorry, like I wonder if we should just get started with the survey and just start just drafting out questions, and then kind of just throwing things at the board, and just we've got this working document. And I just wonder, maybe we should just ask questions, add questions.
So the link to the document is going in the chat. Everybody should have the ability to edit that. If they don't, let me know and I can change it. This is so if you scroll further below, Fred, I can see that you're kind of adding things there. We have a working draft, and this is there was a initial ideas document developed into kind of a first working draft, and what we tried to do was kind of allocate sections for different people. The first bit that I was working on today is kind of the participant information and the consent side of things. But then the original idea was to ask questions to everybody to establish who they are and what they're doing, and then potentially have questions that clinical, so people doing eye tracking clinically would answer, maybe some questions for eye tracking manufacturers. And then we are aware that we will be distributing this to professional bodies, and they might be answering on behalf of a group or behalf of a membership. So that was where we've started. So if you think there are questions that you would like to add to that, that would be really helpful. I can see Fred typing away, so please continue. There are a couple of questions that have been added to the working document already that I think need a little bit of discussion. Is it okay if we start with the information about the questionnaire? Because I feel like we need some agreement on whether we are collecting entirely anonymous responses or whether we are collecting some identifiable information from these people. My feeling from the last meeting was that we did want to collect or ask them some potentially identifiable information, so that firstly we could double check whether we had duplicate responses from the same organisation or from the same people. But this is everything anonymous, is anything potentially identifiable kind of matters in terms of the ethical approvals and the data and how that is handled. Does anybody have a view on their preference?
So just for clarity, you're only intending to ask clinicians and researchers about their use of eye tracking, and they're not going to be supplying any data or anything like that. Is that correct?
So we are not asking for any data. We may ask them if they have existing guidelines currently, but this group was just concerned with clinical eye tracking. So there was a bit of discussion in the last meeting that we need to quite clearly define what we mean by that so that people can respond to the survey and know what we mean by that. So how we've drafted that is eye tracking performed in a clinical setting, i.e., so whether that be a hospital or medical facility, or eye tracking performed in a non-clinical setting, but where the results are shared with a clinician of any speciality or a patient to inform clinical practice. And then what we've done is given the examples of either to support a diagnosis, to investigate the patient, to inform clinical decision-making, and or to measure the outcome of a clinical intervention. So we'd want to make it clear that this is not eye tracking for research purposes, but we accept that, for example, somebody may go to a research centre and have eye tracking done. So it might not take place in a hospital, but if the results are then transferred into a clinical setting in any way, I think we would consider that that is eye tracking for the purposes of providing clinical information.
That makes sense. Just for clarity, I mean, there would be a lot of research going on in hospitals that isn't for diagnosis. So that might be a point of confusion there. So maybe it's what the data is being used for is more important than where it's being reported.
I think that probably needs discussion with the group. If we feel that a researcher is based within a hospital and they are purely taking part in a research study, because that is highly likely, it might even be a clinical research study.
That's probably the most common scenario, because you do go to the hospital to get in contact with a clinical group. So
I think with the definition that Gemma described, I think that would cover it, because if you're going into research, it's not informing clinical outcome. Am I right, Gemma, that there was clinical outcome as a part of this? There has to be some feed forward to patient care.
Yeah, but I guess the point is, if you're in a clinical trial, your tests may be conducted in the building, but they are part of the clinical trial. The results are part of the clinical trial. They're not necessarily being used to make clinical decisions at that time.
Yeah, so that would not count, because it's not part of their care as such. They're just signing up as a clinical trial.
So I think we'd have to make that clear.
So my scenario right now is that I'm working on improving the measures. So I work with clinicians in the hospital. The patients have the regular eye tracking test, and then I do 2 more tests and analyze all 3 tests in order to see if novel methods can improve the result. So one of those tests is used for their diagnosis, and the other 2 are not. Just as an example of something that I think is not unusual.
So I would suggest in that case, the one that's relevant is the one that's being used to inform their care.
Yeah, I would agree. I guess the scenario for another person might be, what if none of the tests are being used to, because yours is quite unique, Fiona. You've got one that is and some that aren't. So you are still doing eye tracking.
I'm sorry. Yeah, well, I'm still doing eye tracking, but because you have to have approval of a device as a medical device in order to run diagnostics. Whenever you want to improve on any medical device, you always have to take measures from the approved device and measures from other devices, or using different methods that you're hoping may improve on it. So because of that, I don't think it's that unusual to have the medically improved device being used for diagnosis alongside several other devices or methods used to see if you can improve on the hit rate of diagnosis, if you like. So in terms of eye tracking in the hospitals, for example, this VHIT test, which tests the visual, it's the VOR response and smooth pursuit and so on, that tend to be used at the moment. There's the interacoustics and one or two other systems that are approved for those measures. But there's a big need, for example, for remote tests, because it's very difficult for children or people who are frail or things like that. So then if you're going to develop new measures using eye tracking, you will have a situation where you have a clinically improved device taking diagnostic measures with several other devices and a load of researchers collecting that data to see what methods can improve hit rate. And what I mean by hit rate is successful diagnosis. So you need the doctors to eventually tell you this person did or did not have whatever condition you're looking to diagnose, in order to see which methods are working the best. And you're kind of expected to have that research done if you want a device to go for clinical trials or to be approved as a medical device. So I don't think it's that unique.
So it seems that we need a decision on if we are interested, if we're wanting to capture responses from people who are doing clinical research, doesn't it? So this is obviously, this is kind of an offshoot group from the what I would call hardcore eye movement researchers, who are based in a idealized situation where they're not seeing patients. I don't know whether I'm describing that well enough or not, but would we be interested in responses from people using eye trackers in clinical research? Matt?
So hopefully you can hear me. I know in the previous meetings when we discussed this, the decision was not to include research in this, because we're primarily trying to inform clinicians. And although there will always be clinicians who also work as researchers, that at the moment, yes, there are a lot of people using eye tracking are also researchers, because it's a kind of it's still relatively new. But perhaps we can address this by just including a question for each of those use cases to say, even though you're using it clinically, are you actively involved in research? And that then you could at least say, okay, these are the people who are just using it clinically, of which there might be not that many at the moment. And then we can...
Sorry, I'm not totally clear on that. Did you mean that people who are using eye tracking, using basically are kind of research focused with their eye tracking, even if it's like in a clinical application domain, you want to exclude them from this survey? It seems a little limiting, but I don't know. Like,
it is potentially limiting because at the moment clinical eye tracking is such an emerging field that you're right, that if we were to exclude research, then you might end up excluding most current uses of it. So I can see the problem.
Because it's easy to exclude that data from our consideration, but like the opposite would, if we don't collect it,
I think, the issue is that because there's so much overlap at the moment between research and clinical, what ideally ISCET is trying to do is to bring this more into clinical use, right? General clinical use, and so that it's not just the research clinicians that are doing this. Obviously, those of us primarily involved in ISCET are research clinicians. So I was suggesting including an additional question just to clarify, so we can, not that we should exclude people, but so we can say if, you know, first of all, the use has to inform a patient diagnosis, otherwise it's pure research. But if it's actually informing a patient diagnosis or management in some way, it could still fall into research. And so perhaps we could just have one question that says, is this clinical use of eye tracking contributing to a research project? You know, is your use of it? Something like that.
I think that makes sense. One other thing one thought I had when looking at this is that, you know, sometimes kind of along this line, people don't fall into neat buckets. And so I'm wondering that whether it makes sense to say, like, what is your primary role, or what would you consider to be your primary role, list any ancillary roles, and then also just say, like, do you use it in this capacity as like a clinician? And then, you know, then you get that survey set. And then are you also involved in industry? You know, like, are you a employee of like a company or something? And then another set of questions. And then do you also conduct research? Another set of questions. And so that way people can answer the things that are relevant to them without, you know, in acknowledgement of the heterogeneity of the multiple roles we play.
Yeah, and we did have some discussion on that in the last meeting, and we were agreeing with the kind of the tick box, but maybe your way of doing that, Fred, where they're explicitly asked each question, do you use it in this capacity, might be better than them just ticking. And I think we would get that information about, is the eye tracking performed purely for clinical research? Because I guess I'm just a little bit unsure about the taking purely clinical research out. I think my concern is that if we exclude everything, are we going to kind of miss some information? I think that's the bit I'm struggling with a bit. Fiona has her hand up, actually.
Yeah, thanks. So I think that any of those approaches would get quite complex quite quickly, because you also have cases where you are using eye movements to diagnose people, but it's purely to categorize them into groups for research, you know. So what I was suggesting is that you rather much simpler solution, that instead of saying you do it in a clinical setting, you do it in here or there, that you just ask, do you record eye movements for the purposes of diagnosis? Full stop. And it doesn't matter where that's done. And then you could ask, do you record eye movements for purposes other than diagnosis, but that might have an effect on how eye tracking is used for diagnosis in other contexts, or something like that? Because I just feel like eye movements have been used in clinical diagnosis for such a long time, and there's such a lot of different approaches. Like, I don't see any, like, we haven't touched on things like eye tracking being used in things like perimetry testing of the visual field, where it's really not used to record eye movements so much as at the moment in current systems just to know whether the person is fixating where they should or not. It is kind of eye tracking, but that happens in opticians, you know. So I think the location is much, it is going to get into a complex set of rabbit holes. Whereas if you just keep it simple, are you recording for the purposes of diagnosis? Yes or no? And then, are you recording for the purposes of improving clinical measures? Are you recording for other purposes in research and so on, rather than focusing on the setting so much? Maybe, just a suggestion.
Thanks, Fiona. Any other thoughts on that?
I agree with Fiona's suggestion. I would just extend to, in terms of, I'd say, diagnosis or management, because of course you may not be diagnosing, you might be just, you know, following up a patient.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah.
Do you think it's worth asking about investigation? Because I wonder sometimes, particularly with the point you raised about, you know, some of these are not classed as medical devices, so you can't actually say that, you know, what you described as, you know, I have a set eye tracker that I have to compare others to. Other centres may not have that eye tracker that is a medical device, so they may just be using an eye tracker in their clinical setting, and they won't be able to say, I'm using it to make a diagnosis, but well, they shouldn't be technically. And sometimes eye tracking companies are quite careful about that. So I wonder whether we should word it as for the purposes of investigation, diagnosis, management, clinical research, or other.
I mean, it's illegal to use a non-approved device. There is one loophole where if the hospital has developed it themselves, the specialists have developed it themselves, but other than that, they can't be used for diagnosis. So I don't know, do you want to get into that in this work?
I'll come back to Matt on that.
Am I right? We spoke about this at some previous meeting. I think it was the last subcommittee meeting. Did we not? The subcommittee about not, incriminating clinicians who are using something off-label, as it were. So being careful about how we phrase the questions and just making sure that when those questions are presented, they don't present it in such a way to say that, yes, I'm using it to do something I shouldn't be doing with it, even if it is beneficial to a patient. So I can't remember, Gemma, whether there was a specific conclusion we came to in the last meeting. Do you remember that, or was it maybe at a main meeting?
I do remember that discussion, and I think that's where we said we would try. Sorry, Matt, I'm just going to mute you.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. Sorry, it's just we're getting a little bit of feedback. I think that's where we said we would kind of have to delicately word things for the purposes. I think that's maybe why we shied away from that, Fiona. I feel like I'd have to go back and look at the exact kind of conclusions we made. But I think that's where we said the questions we were going to draft, we would kind of leave them open to everybody to comment on about whether they felt they could answer that without falsely representing what they're doing, but without also getting in trouble for using it not for the purpose that it's been certified or licensed for. It is a delicate issue.
I mean, you could try and approach it a different way, and I'm just off the top of my head here, but you could ask them, are you aware of whether or not your tracker has been approved as a medical device? I mean, that could also be informative, and it, gives them the option to say, I am not aware. I mean, you could also look at some of the questions being anonymous. I mean, or having a separate anonymous questionnaire from the other. You could have both an anonymous part. Part A is anonymous. Part B, we ask for some information about the settings you work in or something like that.
Yeah, we have. So the anonymity is something that I would like to discuss before we finish. And I think this is where we maybe do have to accept that some people will be using eye tracking under a research umbrella within a hospital, for example, because their eye tracker isn't certified as a medical device. So they might have to say, actually, I'm doing this for clinical research. I'm just wondering if that's the way some people use their devices.
Do we also want to include studies of kind of like these meta studies of like providers who are doing diagnoses and things like that? So like the study of practice rather than the actual direct application of some type of like clinical execution?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean there, Fred. Could you elaborate?
So like studies of radiologists and like expertise in reading radiological images, studies of surgery and fatigue, studies of basically quality control. So I think that it's relevant, and at some point might turn into practical guidelines, but it's definitely a different kind of focus than, you run some eye tracking battery on an individual and collect some data.
So my initial thought on that is that's probably going a little bit off track of what we initially set out to do. But does anybody have a feeling on that? I mean, it feels different. That's like you say, that's an application of a technique to a clinical scenario that is different to testing a patient sat in front of you. So my feeling is that might be a bit off track. Does anybody else have a view on that?
I would say that's definitely research rather than.
Well, if it comes into like kind of like a driver safety, right? Like guidelines for when you are no longer qualified to be seeing patients, then it does impact the clinical realm. But I could see that keeping it like basically if there's not a patient directly involved in the eye tracking collection, then we're not like that's outside of the scope at this moment. Maybe it will be expanded to include it in the future, but keeping the scope limited probably is an advantage as well. So like the patient focus then needs to be kind of just as a clarification of areas of interest.
Yeah.
And then I think explicitly providing those counter examples is going to be really helpful. Even if it's like, click on this if you need more information, just so that we don't inundate people with because there's already a lot to read. I'm looking at some of these questions and like I'm kind of falling asleep because I have very short attention span.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, and I'm aware that sometimes, by the time you add examples of what it is and what it isn't, it can end up very long. So I think clicking here, a box to appear for more information, I think would be quite helpful. But maybe making that definition that the patient is involved, so the eye tracking data collection is from a patient, would be helpful. Okay. Any other points on that?
Well,
yeah,
go on.
Mine is a 2-second thing. I was just going to say, just to reiterate that it sounds like asking, are you using this data for diagnosis or to decide what's the condition of the patient is, would cover all of that, potentially. That's it. Sorry.
I was thinking that because out of this fruitful discussion, like if we just have some open questions, it would of course give us a hard time in the analysis, but an open question I think would also give us good information, because even I know that because it both Fiona's point and Fred's point, I will just touch on both because I know that we might not want to know if people are using it not licensed, but this already happens. So if we get some info that, for example, 50% of the people are using it like that, that is an info. We're not endorsing that, but we're just surveying. But we will not ask them. We would just keep it open. Just let people say. I think this could give us something at the end, because also we will use this in helping them, putting standards, helping them how to maybe later on make this. I don't know. That was what came into my mind. Because if we give them a directed question like, do you know this is legal or not? Of course, he will just like skip. He wants, and he might not be aware, because these devices are really still really early, and it's really silly that this is not so off track. But if they say that some applications and some things for tracking and well-being, and they are not obliged even to have it FDA approved and medical devices, and they're used, which is like, this is a fact. But the open question could give us a way out. And what Fred mentioned is that also, if I'm a surgeon and they're surveying my cognitive and my skills with eye trackers now built in on the microscopes and and things, I also would like to know some of the standards, so at least to be aware of it, because this is already also happening. This might not be the scope of this survey, but I don't know if also came into my mind. Knowing also would be good. Yeah, that's.
I think the recognition that not everybody's going to neatly fit into a bucket, as Fred said, will be hopefully addressed by the use of these kind of open questionnaires. So we could open questions, so we can look a little bit more in detail about that. I think we're at the stage where we've kind of spent quite a bit of time kind of discussing it, and I think that's really helpful. I noticed that Fred's been kind of typing away on the document, and I do think we need to try and move towards actual wording of questions. And if there is, what I'd encourage everybody to do is have a look at the current document, and if you're unhappy or in disagreement, or even if you just think you can word something better, I would encourage you to kind of add that onto the document. Last time we did try and allocate sections to different people to try and make sure we had some coverage, but they're not fixed in stone. I think just contribute to the parts that you feel you can best contribute to. I'm aware that Onyeka's not had an opportunity to speak as well today either. So is there anything that you've been listening to or you've come across that you particularly want to comment on, Onyeka?
Nothing so serious. I just wanted to ask initially about one site that I came across. It's called the Simian Collective, but based on our discussions, I've now deciphered that it shouldn't actually be in our list because it's actually on primate research, but applied to scientific and medical discoveries. So we should definitely take it out of our list. I added it was in the former suggested lists, and I went through the website. I was able to read about it, but it's about neuroscience research, but not basically on humans. So it should go out of the list, really.
Yeah, I mean, this came up in the previous kind of work we did on reporting guidelines, and I think in the end we said that was human and non-human primates. I think that's what we went for in the end. But my interpretation of what we're doing is that we're doing this on human patients.
Yes.
But I think that hasn't been stated, so probably does need to be clarified. Would people agree that we're just, because that's an interesting point, I've not even thought of that.
I guess no one's talked about veterinary eye tracking type stuff. If you were to put an animal in front of it in order to diagnose a disorder, I don't know if anyone's ever looked at that or even considered that. Obviously, animals get used in eye movement research, but not in terms of to treat the animal for a pathology that it's got. So I don't know that it's necessary to state that it's human clinical, but if for the avoidance of doubt we're going to do that, then that could be included. But it may be a step more than we need.
But you would have a quite normal scenario where you have animal models of different diseases, and very often that will be the first contact with eye tracking in order to see what kind of eye movement measures might be used to differentiate the animal models of a specific disease from conspecifics without that disease. So I mean, it's totally up to you whether it is or not. I'm just raising that it's a quite common scenario to have primate models of different kinds of neurological disorders and to use them as models to investigate appropriate measures of or diagnostic measures.
I agree. I'd say that this survey, though, is meant to be of clinicians who are actively working to treat disease. And so although their practice may be informed by that research, that would be strictly research.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about some of the like strabismus work as well. You may well have people that are clinical that actually do eye tracking with non-human, models as well. But I think that's where we have to be really clear about who we want to answer this and what information we want to make sure it's very relevant to the population group that we're interested in. Okay.
Yeah, and just to add that you would also, in that scenario, treat the animal model in order to test if a certain treatment works. So I think that it's really a matter of choice whether you want to include them in this survey or not, because it's certainly relevant. And in terms of eye data quality, there isn't a huge difference in what we're looking for. But it's fair enough if you are only interested in humans, then just, I think that's fair enough to limit it that way.
It feels like for kind of guideline development that we kind of want to primarily work with humans, but we need to accept that there may be non-human work that comes from that, because we want to make sure that the guideline development is being driven from humans towards the animal rather than the other way round. Does that make sense? That actually what we need in clinical practice for humans is kind of first and foremost what we're trying to get out of this.
That makes sense to me, but just as you're talking there, something occurs to me, and I don't at all know the answer. But I wonder if it could be interesting to talk to people who are working with animal models, purely from the point of view that actually animal research is probably more standardized. I know it's weird to say that, but it would not surprise me if there were standards for the circumstances under which you can record data in animal research that we're not aware of. So it just occurred to me when you were saying there, and I don't know the answer, but I know that animal research is very highly standardized. So you never know, there might be something useful there for humans too.
That is a very interesting point, and I'd not considered that in the slightest. Certainly there's quite a lot of zebrafish work that goes on here in Sheffield, and there's eye tracking zebrafish studies and standard do OKN, don't they? They kind of like pin them to a little thing and do OKN studies on zebra. It's amazing.
Yeah, but especially with primates, it's very highly regulated.
Yeah. I have no contacts in that world at all. Does anybody know if there's an ability to find out about these standards? Apologies for the background noise. Go for it, Fiona. I wasn't sure if Rasha was putting her hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, me too. That's why I muted again.
Oh, sorry. But I can say something. Like, I don't know. Do you want us to not to say human, and then the questions we will send, if we find such institutions, we can send them also the questions? Like is it like we not specify for that sake? I don't know. That's what I thought, but I don't know. Even if the questionnaire will be helpful in that aspect. I was just trying to adjust the lights, so sorry, but also I thought this could be a good response.
I think it's easy enough to get in contact with people doing primate research, who are often, anyway, also neurologists or working with neurologists and so on. So I would know a few that I would know who to talk to, but I don't know them. I haven't collaborated with them.
I think it would be interesting to know if they do have guidelines for eye tracking in their, whoever their participants are. It might be that that's useful for us to know. My feeling is that we don't particularly want for them to complete this survey unless they are also doing clinical eye tracking in humans. That was my assumption, but go for it, Rasha.
I think we can do a focus group on that, on a separate, and like not in the survey, but it would be very interesting to have them like a focus group. Like, it's good that Fiona has some contacts maybe, and try to dig into that maybe in parallel with the survey, or but it might complicate things on a second thought too, because then you need to reformulate all the questions. But also, if we have contact to them, so it would be good to make a different mission for that.
So Matt has suggested that it's probably something that could go back to the full ISCET group about whether we explore standards in other aspects of eye tracking. Yeah, I agree. I think if we keep this focused on human patients for the purposes of diagnosis or assessing the condition of the patient, I feel like that's the wording that we've kind of come to. And I'm aware also we've run over time by 10 minutes. So I'd like to kind of try and wrap it up if possible. Is there anything essential that needs discussion now before people can continue with working on the survey draft 2? What's the deadline? To be decided, Matt, I think. I'm aware that this could probably go on forever and ever. So we do need to try and come up with a deadline for what we feel is practical. It doesn't feel like we have a full working draft at present. It feels like we still have some gaps. So I was going to summarize this meeting to the working group and encourage people to, again, kind of work on different parts that they feel they can contribute to. I tried to make this meeting a little bit sooner and not let the deadline slip. The main will be organised after the survey results are in. Okay, so we're holding everybody up then. Okay. How do people feel about another 2-week deadline to try and get this version of the questionnaire to at least have completed kind of questions in each section, and then the next part of the discussion can focus on trying to either have some agreement on where we have less questions or more detail?
We'll try speaking to see if this works. I would suggest that if we maybe say like in 2 weeks we will revise through all of the questions, and then maybe Gemma, as you're taking the lead on this, I would suggest if you just want to go through and rationalise them as you see fit, make a note of where you've deleted questions and modified them and so on, and then present to us maybe a final draft as you see it. Send us also the narrative as to what you've changed and why, and then we can comment on those changes, because I think because there's so many of us and we all have slightly different angles, it might be better for having one person who's led that.
I'm happy with that. Your audio is crazy today, Matt. I don't know.
I think it's Google, because I've been on Zoom meetings all day with no problem, but Google Meet seems to be a problem.
It was like you were on a roller coaster at that point. We were with you on that journey. Okay, let's do that then. Is everybody happy with a 2-week deadline, communication from me to the rest of the working group to ask them to fill in kind of gaps within the questionnaire, and then me to work on rationalising that and for a discussion at the next meeting, with the idea to kind of have a final working draft? Is that okay? Okay, lovely. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions. And thank you, Fiona. I think Matt's comment about you potentially speaking at the larger ISCET group, I think will be really helpful. I think there's a lot of people in the group that'd be quite interested to hear what you've got to say and what you've shared with us today. So thank you. If there are any particular references that you think we should be looking at whilst we're doing this work, please feel free to kind of share them. And I wonder whether it's, oh, Matt, we got to have a presentation or a document summarising your previous work. Yeah, so it's whether that could go in my summary of the...
I'm happy to do that, but I want to be very upfront about the fact that I'm not really sure what ISCET is yet, or I'm just familiarizing myself with the remit and so on. I mean, I worked, it wasn't just me doing that work. We have a still active committee of 15 international experts on eye tracking working on that standardization work So there's a couple of papers that are already out, and there's a huge data set, and there's a lot of data that's being collected that's potentially useful. But I would also like to understand what ISCET is and what the goals are and the remit is, maybe before I know what is and isn't relevant from our work.
Yeah, I think what we probably need to establish fairly soon is whether essentially we're all trying to do the same thing, and we've got two separate groups working in parallel who just happen to have now crossed over a little bit. I've just popped a link into the ISCET Google site, so hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit more there. But maybe Matt, would you be able to take?
I mean, I can add that it doesn't have to be right now. We are over time, so I'm not. You know, I can I don't know how to answer until I have a better sense of what the goals and remit of ISCET are, and I'm just not familiar yet. And I can go to this link and check out your previous meetings.
Yeah, and I think in the interest of time as well, maybe a conversation with Matt, if there's Matt and Russia, if there's further questions about that, I think would be helpful, rather than us using this working group to have that conversation. Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you, Fiona, for the contribution.